In today's video for Alpha Universe, we're going to answer some common questions about Sony's E-mount. We'll get into what the E in E-mount stands for, and what's the difference between E and FE on these lenses. Let's break this all down in plain English. To understand what is the Sony E-mount, we have to go back to 2010 when they released these two cameras, the NEX3 and NEX5. These cameras were pretty special for their time. They didn't have a mirror box like what you'd normally see in a DSLR body, which made the body much smaller, but they somehow managed to have the same sized APS-C sensor that you'd find in those larger bodies. Sony needed a name for the mount on this new mirrorless system of cameras, and they went with E-mount. But what exactly does the E stand for? Many people guessed it stood for evolution or electronic, but they would be wrong. The E actually stands for 18 mount. But what's that all about? Let's get a bit nerdy for a second, since knowing this might make you the smartest photographer in the room. You see, DSLR cameras in that time had that mirror box that I mentioned earlier, and because of that, the distance between the camera sensor and the mount would typically be over 42 millimeters on most cameras. This is known as flange distance. There was an angled mirror that was covering the sensor, and there needed to be enough room in the camera body for it to flip up to expose the sensor when you press the shutter and you take a photo. With the Sony E-mount, this system is what we know today as a mirrorless system, meaning that there is no moving mirror in front of the camera sensor. Now, because of that, they were able to achieve an 18 millimeter flange distance, which brought along all the benefits that would eventually dominate the camera industry. Smaller and lighter camera bodies and lenses, electronic viewfinders that give you complete live view exposure and white balance previews, and much more. That is what the E stands for, but what about this? I've got two lenses here. One of them says E and the other says FE. What's that all about? Remember those first two E-mount cameras I showed you earlier, the NEX3 and NEX5? These had an APS-C sensor in them, and any lenses that would mount onto these cameras would be denoted with an E. Anytime you see an E alone in the lens model, this typically means that the lens is compatible with APS-C Sony cameras. A few years later, Sony managed to do something massive and introduce the original Alpha 7 series cameras, the Alpha 7 and the Alpha 7R. These cameras introduced full-frame sensors to their mirrorless system while keeping the same 18 millimeter mount. Every Sony mirrorless camera uses the E-mount, but we now need lenses that are designed for a full-frame sensor. That's where FE comes in. Full-frame lenses that have the letters FE in the model, which stands for full-frame 18 millimeter mount. So what are the real differences between E and FE lenses? It's actually pretty simple. E lenses are designed for APS-C sensors and are typically smaller, lighter, and more affordable, and they project a smaller image circle onto the sensor. More on that in a second. FE lenses are designed for full-frame sensors, which are often bigger than E lenses, but with that, they have the ability to carry some high-end features that you might not find in those lenses. It also projects a larger image circle onto the sensor, meaning that it covers more of the sensor. Now here's what's cool about all of this. Whether you're looking at an E or an FE lens, either one can be mounted to both APS-C and full-frame cameras. Let's say you have an APS-C camera like the Sony Alpha 6700, and you put on a full-frame FE lens, such as the 40mm f2.5. The lens works perfectly, but the image looks kind of more zoomed in. That's because APS-C sensors are smaller than full-frame sensors and only use the center of the lens. This creates a 1.5x crop. To find the full frame equivalent, just multiply the lens focal length by 1.5. So a 40mm lens on an APS-C camera gives you the same field of view as a 60mm lens on full frame. Now let's flip it around. What happens if you put an APS-C lens on a full frame camera, like mounting a 20mm f2.8 E-mount lens on the Alpha 7CR? APS-C lenses project a smaller image circle, so they don't cover the entirety of that full-frame sensor. Sony full-frame cameras fix this by automatically switching to APS-C crop mode, which crops the sensor so that you don't see the dark corners, you don't see the inside of the barrel of the lens, which is often called vignetting. With crop mode on, the lens works fine, but you're only using part of the sensor. Because you're not using the entire 61 megapixel resolution in this example, that means that you end up with about 26 megapixels. The 1.5x crop still applies, so that 20mm lens gives you a 30mm full frame equivalent field of view. Now think about this scenario. Let's say that you get into the Sony mirrorless system with an APS-C camera like the Alpha 6700, and you start off with their 20mm f2.8 lens. Sometime down the road, you want to go to a full frame camera and you end up getting the Alpha 7 CR. You could actually take that same lens and you could continue to use it on your full frame camera with the crop factor that we discussed earlier. Then imagine things go really good and you decide that you want to get into making Hollywood movies. You pick up a Sony cinema camera like the Sony Venice, which was used to film major blockbuster movies like Top Gun Maverick and Avatar: The Way of Water, just to name a few. You could take that same 20mm lens and you could use it on those cameras without any kind of adapters, just mount it and shoot. From what I could see, there's no other camera system that offers its users that kind of flexibility. If this video helped you finally understand E-mount and the differences between E and FE lenses, let me know in the comments. Don't forget to like and subscribe to stay up to date on everything happening here at Alpha Universe. And before you head out, be sure to check out the playlist that you see here on screen to learn even more about Sony cameras and lenses. See you there.